I'm cock-a-hoop, exultantly boastful, to introduce our guest speaker today, Gilda Williams. Dr. Williams is a lecturer on the MFA in Curating programme at Goldsmiths and a lecturer on the MA in Contemporary Art at Sotheby's Institute of Art. Williams is a London correspondent for Art Forum magazine and author of The Gothic from the superb Documents of Contemporary Art series by the MIT Press and Whitechapel Gallery. From 1994 to 2005, Williams was editor and commissioning editor for Contemporary Art for Fade and Press London. There she edited and commissioned some 50 monographs in the Contemporary Artist series, as well as the Themes and Movement anthologies, many of which I'm sure, like myself, any serious bibliomaniac will have on your bookshelves. In her book, Dr. Williams recommends that you use spicy vocabulary in your art writing. I don't wish to disappoint our guest. I've stopped myself from using the word phantasmagoria, because it's far too often used in art writing, and have opted instead for my favourite word of all time, which is eunoia, which is the shortest word in the English language that includes all 5 vowels, A, E, I, O, and U, and it means beautiful thinking. Certainly, her 2014 publication, How to Write About Contemporary Art, is an example of beautiful thinking. Gilda's book clearly demarcates the different types of writing, explaining versus evaluating, and the context the different types of writing should be utilised for. The book is aimed at helping people write about art in the context of academic essays, catalogue texts, gallery guides and wall labels, CVs, personal artist statements, etc. It also clearly states what the essential patterns are to be found in a good piece of art writing. I'm really delighted that Dr. Williams is generously pulling back the veil and, in the tradition of the Greek analytical tradition of ekphrasis, has generously agreed to speak out about the art of art writing. Finally, it's worth drawing to your attention Dr. Williams' new book, not just hot off the press, but practically sizzling. On and by Andy Warhol, which will have its book launch at the Whitechapel Gallery in London on Wednesday the 17th of March 2016, but it is already available on Amazon if anyone here wants to get an advance copy. As Bob Colacello, special correspondent for Vanity Fair, has said about this important book, On and by Andy Warhol is an epic achievement. Gilda Williams has collected what seems like every word ever written about or uttered by the most influential artist of our time to produce a verbal collage portrait that is bold, revealing, multidimensional and original. If Andy were alive, he would probably say, "Oh wow, why didn't I think of that?" I'm thrilled that Gilda has found time in her busy schedule to come and talk to us today about her work. Please join me in giving a warm, friendly Yorkshire welcome to Gilda Williams.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for coming. So I wrote this book called How to Write About Contemporary Art. This was on Twitter. It just came on a couple of days ago. I love this picture. This book was written as a joke. Okay, I never ever thought it would be published. I don't know if you have secret files somewhere in the back of your laptop. We don't teach like this anymore, right? You're not allowed to tell a student, look, this is what you're doing wrong, just do this, okay? So I would fantasize at night after being much more diplomatic in my teaching, just to tell people exactly what they ought to do. And eventually I pitched this to Thames and Hudson, and they liked it. I had the advantage of, as Simon was saying, I worked with a lot of very good writers for a long time. For about 20 years I was an editor, and was able to see patterns, even across very different types of writing, of how effective writers succeed. I also thought as an editor, if I change someone's text, which is a finished piece of work, right? It's like a curator changing an artwork. You really shouldn't. I think you should respect it. But if I did make a suggested change, I should explain why. What was wrong? How was I improving it? And you had to, I actually thought, verbalize what the changes were and why. And so I had this very, very long training of trying to explain how to improve art writing before I spent about 10 years teaching it. Now I'm going to look at a pretty broad spectrum of art writing, both art writing that stands aside from artworks, okay, whether explaining it or evaluating it, criticizing it, and texts that work as artworks themselves, are somehow embedded with art. And I'm going to look at a number of different practices of contemporary artists who use text and use writing in interesting and embedded ways. I'm quite against the artist statement. I think it's a throwback to the 20th century. We're going to look at where the artist statement came from and my resistance to it and alternatives to it, which is why I look at Warhol, who could not write at all, wrote something like 100 books nonetheless, having found 1 million alternative ways to produce text about his own work. So we're going to begin a few images from about 100 years ago. This is Greenberg and Mondrian. This is about almost exactly 100 years ago. And this is a sort of perfect example of a type of art critic who no longer exists. As an art critic, I will confess I slightly pine this. I wish I could be like that. I was sort of the thing standing between you and the artwork was someone who could put to verbalize, who'd explain it to you. Okay, so the artwork was this mute thing. The artist is not even present. Okay, those of you who can try to think what Piet Mondrian looks like. Who knows? The critic is there, ready and waiting, able, armed with the tools, the verbal tools, to make this meaningful, create context and description, and bring these to bring this to you. Okay, it's a model that is completely fallen into crisis, and we'll look at why. So this is the Greenberg. He's the voice, right? And of course, the artist is basically a Neanderthal who can grunt and throw paint and needs somebody who can put what they are doing into words. Now, it's no surprise that this model comes into crisis. And when does it come into crisis? It comes into crisis right across the 60s, the 50s and 60s, mostly the 60s, when philosophers and other thinkers start asking, well, who's doing the talking? Who's talking for whom? Who's speaking for? And artists are among those groups who have been silent for centuries, I think, and are trained actually in MFA programs and others to begin talking about and verbalizing their own work. Okay, this was a great freedom. Whenever artists whom I teach struggle and hate these artist statements, and I understand why they do, I also remind them, it took centuries for artists, artists like Velázquez suffered that they weren't allowed to speak and defend their work and explain it in a really sustained way. Now artists are perhaps even asked too much to explain their work, and then I'll go into why I think this is the case. Another image from about 100 years ago is, of course, this fountain you've seen too many times, right? Duchamp's fountain. What happens over the course of the last 100 years, not only do artists gain voices and other figures gain voices, but to look at art, you needed a special piece of information, all right? You couldn't just assess this looking at form and craft and beauty and all of the categories which had been ingrained for a very, very long time. You needed to know this is a radical artistic gesture, okay? And until you understood this, you couldn't access the work. So not only do you need a piece of nugget of sort of language to accompany looking at art, but actually there's new words like ready-made, like minimal, like conceptual, like all of the different media. So language is actually changing, expanding, and its place changes. As Boris Groys put it, it's like artworks come into the world naked. They're like babies, and they need to be cloaked in language to give them some kind of covering, some kind of protection, something that allows them to sort of gain traction in the art world. Now, the suspicion around language and critics is very, very old. Okay, this is a sort of classic modernist. Critics are goofballs, and they can't tell the difference between garbage and real art. But this kind of making fun is really, really old. Okay, the suspicion around the critic and the relationship between language and words and artworks is almost as old as art criticism itself. Does anyone know where art criticism comes from, its origins? It's actually, it's a side effect, you could say, is symptomatic of the French Revolution. It comes alongside when it is no longer the king and clergy to say, you know, art yes, art no, this work is good, this work isn't, this we'll take, this we won't. As those kind of figures of power are disputed, a new figure emerges to say, okay, yes, to begin to decipher and evaluate artworks. And the artist, the critic, is this sort of self-appointed figure who takes upon themselves to replace those earlier undisputable figures of judgment. Okay, so if once upon a time these were, the art world's made of constituencies, right, and roles. I'm going to list those as being the classic kind of figures making up the art world traditionally. There were two categories who did all the writing, okay? Artists, curators, museum directors did minimal writing. The director of the museum wrote, you know, a little foreword maybe at the beginning of the catalog. All of the writing, there was a special cast of figures within the art world who did the writing, all right? Who were the bridges between what was happening in the museums and in the galleries and how it could be explained in language. They were rarities, all right? They had this special ability to be able to write and think in words about art. I still think it's a pretty special ability. I still think not everybody can do it, but that's not kind of the way the world works. Everyone, if you work in the art world, you have to write. You just have to. There are infinite number of instances in which you are asked to explain yourself, you are asked to fund your project, you are asked to persuade any number of bodies that it's worth doing. Even a curator has to explain it to artists. A lot of curators, traditional curators, didn't write. Caspar Koenig didn't write. Hans-Ulrich Oberst doesn't write. He just does interviews. It'd be very difficult to do, you know, to be able to work that way anymore. Curators are constantly asked to write. In fact, some people really even find this surprising that curators didn't used to write. They seem like they are necessarily writers by nature, but not necessarily. But once upon a time, this was not the case. So not only does everybody write, but there's all these new figures who fill the art world, and they all write, okay? So you have many, many more people in the art world, many, many different types of roles, and many, many more writers. And on top of all that, if those four categories, more or less, were the four which existed, the kinds of writing about art that we had, museum labels probably is missing from that list. There are now many, 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 many more types of writing that you're also asked to write, okay? There are art forms, art writing forms that absolutely did not exist in, 100 years ago. And so look how much bigger our sort of pool of writers and pool of texts has become. If you want an explanation why are critics paid so badly, it's supply and demand, you know? I mean, there's only artists make art. They're the only ones in all this who make art. Everybody writes, okay? And so the cheapness around writing is really, for someone who takes it seriously, like me, who'd like to be, prized for my writing, this is a bit of a problem. On the other hand, if you are an artist and you are good at writing, okay, if you happen to have that additional niche skill, if you're Hito Sterl, if you're Seth Price, if you're Liam Gillick, if you're John Kelsey, there are a lot. Think of how many artists whom we admire now are also very, very good writers. That is a huge advantage, okay? Just like, if you were a 16th century painter and you could render baby flesh really well for your cherubs, that was an advantage. There's a weird additional niche skill which is definitely a huge advantage. And I see students who are artists who are good at making art and really struggle to write. And it is, for sure, I think, a disadvantage for them. And I'll get into other sort of problems with the artist statement. On the other hand, I think it's had some good effects, this, okay? Miranda July, I don't know if anyone's read her novels. First Bad Man, has anyone read it? It's fantastic. And she's an artist, and she's able to access a certain kind of literary voice, I think, partially through her training as an artist. I might add, one thing I've noticed at Goldsmiths is that people who are writers are going to art school. In other words, I get very, very exceptionally talented writers, and I think, why? We're happy to have you, but why did you not think of creative writing MFA at Norwich or something? Because the art schools give them a freedom. It's exactly what happened with film in the 90s. Instead of going to film school, people preferred to go to art school, people like Steve McQueen, because they had a freedom and an interest in a level of teaching, or the types of teachers that they were more interested in. So watch this space in terms of, I think, the relationship between writing and language. I'm sure we'll see more sort of very, very interesting writers coming out of art education and the art world. Okay, so that's what art writing was once upon a time, and it is, of course, a very, very, very expanded field, if you will. I might add, I think things are getting better. Okay, this worked because the art world is incredibly tolerant of bad writing. It's the science world also apparently is very, very tolerant of bad writing. We put up with very difficult to read, barely communicative text. This, I think, is getting better. I think people are becoming much more demanding of their writers. I think writing is improving, and we have far more interesting writers, I think, than we had even 20 years ago. We're moving away from academic or any single type of writing to have journalistic writing, diary writing. I think review writing, criticism is changing. The internet, I think, has been a great thing for art writing. Somehow people became much less self-conscious writing about art on the internet than when they were committing to paper. I'm not sure why. And it freed writing up a lot. In magazines, it's much more common now to write I think and I believe, to write from the first person and admit one's own bias, which even sort of 10, 15 years ago was not acceptable. So I think things are improving. On the other hand, one of the reasons that I wrote this book is that it's an entry-level job, writing. Okay, and my students will say, well, I've got this really gallery job. All I do is like write press releases. It's bad. You're basically making coffee, right? And actually, writing press releases well is not that easy. It's not an entry-level job, but it is considered one. It's like art writing with training wheels. You know, people who want to be art critics, that's their sort of entry point. So I guess it serves a certain purpose. But why? Okay, so why all this writing? Why all this language? Certainly, the numbers of people who are interested and the preparation of a lot of the art audiences are not there. Okay, they're not able quickly to access all of the artworks they see. Especially if you think at an art fair, can you imagine trying to give each artwork the kind of time and attention and interpretative skills that you would need? It's part of a system of acceleration. I think a lot of art writing that exists and that you're called upon to write, especially as artists, is to accelerate the consumption of art. Okay, I don't have time to work this thing out. Just give me the juice. Okay, help me through this very, very, very rapidly. Texts get shorter and shorter. If you see the Frieze art book, do you know that yearbook they put out? It used to be 150 words, now it's 70. Okay, for each artwork. Quicker, 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 faster, faster. And texts are a shortcut. All right, their artist statements, I think, are really written to accelerate the consumption of one's own work. And I think if, as an artist, you might really want, if you are an artist, you might want to resist that. I think there's a real politics around why artist statements are constantly required. And you know, it's a cliche to say, well, the statement is the artwork, but I think there's a lot of kind of truth in that. People are hungry for information. Books do beautifully. The art publishing world apparently is flourishing. That's good. This is all good news. There's more and more people are keen, people are curious, people are educated, all right? And they are completely accepted this idea that you access art through texts, which has led me to the conclusion that we produce, the art world produces as much text as we produce art. All right, there is as much language being produced as visual information, as purely visual information, and we will look at where those overlap. It is a text-producing machine, the art world, the way we do it. And a lot of it is completely unacknowledged. Okay, so a lot of texts enter the art world with no author, all right? Nobody wrote the press releases, nobody wrote museum labels, nobody wrote a lot of the stuff that seems to just sort of bubble up like lava. Sometimes there's an initial and you can work out who wrote it, you can assume who wrote it, but a lot of it is sort of, it's just everywhere, okay, without any author and with assumptions about how they're written, how they're being consumed. And so it's a given, okay? The text has to be set alongside and helping us through this passage from observation to understanding. And increasingly on the internet, okay? Whereby if you look at art magazines on the internet, even more than, somehow to me it's even more apparent how text and image really are equal, okay? They're given equal kind of weight. The assumption that you're going to read a lot is there. And I think it's gotten better, okay? I think writing as a result, as actually, by and large, there's very, very good journalistic writing, creative writing, alternatives to old-fashioned reviews and catalogs that I think there's a space for that. And certainly if you want to write, just start a blog. You know, once upon a time you had to get past editors. You don't have to anymore. And it's hugely liberating. It means you have all the space in the world. You can write however you want. I'm very, very pro that. I think, you know, those kinds of self-publishing is great. A great way to change the way we write about art. So it's also the screen. I think we need to think about how the screen, our relationship to art. I'm always interested in when people turn their back to art, what that means, what is really being looked at, and what is important. How do we access art? This is, in any case, in other words, this is beyond language. All right, her relationship perhaps to that artwork has nothing to do with language. This relationship has nothing to do with language. We mistrust, as tourists look at artwork in a kind of that experience barely exists anymore. Okay, where you are, the assumption is that you're a fairly informed person, and yet you can access this in some place that is beyond language and is purely experiential. I think this has become a bit of a fantasy. Has anyone read Ben Lerner's Leaving the Etosha Station? Fantastic novel. Really good. You should go read it. It opens with this, okay, where this guy is at the Prado and he's being completely overwhelmed by the art, so much so that he begins to weep. And at this point, all the guards come in, and people are worried about this guy. You're not that kind of transcendental experience, which is, of course, why it's in a museum and why you'd have a guard and why we care about this stuff, is actually he's going too far. All right, we expect to be reined in by things like thought and language and rationalism, even in front of art. Okay, so, all right, so I think this is a far more common relationship to art. Apparently, by the way, the students in this picture were asked to write something about the painting. All right, this is the sort of genesis of this artwork, and so they were, as we all do. Okay, we all identify with this. It's easy to make fun of them, but we can all identify with this. Really, that you avail yourself of some other kind of information, and there's a mistrust, basically, of the artwork. Without some kind of help. And we have, you know, we no longer do what Lawrence Weiner told, learn to read art. I'm very pro that, learn to read art. Okay, you don't necessarily have to translate into art or translate into words or find ways in which to avail yourself. You know, you don't need a language support to understand art, although the assumption is always there. Okay, so with that as an introduction, okay, the next, we have two sort of longer sections. One is on some good art writing, good and bad art writing, all right, a kind of practical, what I think, if you're starting out, what you might want to think about it when you're writing about art. And then we'll look at some people who have other relationships to text and art and some less conventional examples. Okay, so my very favorite piece of writing. By the way, I think good writing is good writing. I think you need imagination. I think you need ideas. I think you need vocabulary. I think you need to know how to punctuate. Like, I'm really old-fashioned. I think if you really want to learn how to write, you need to kind of learn how to write, believe it or not, and read. And you know, like, I might as well be an English teacher, really, because I do believe in all that stuff. Okay, so my favorite little piece of art writing ever was in response to this painting, and it was described in the 19th century as they look like the Baker's family who have just won the big lottery prize. Okay, there are a lot of reasons I like that. I even got a couple of laughs. Humor is very difficult to translate across centuries, but this somehow does. It's funny. It gets at what they look like. Okay, like. By the way, if someone is a baker's son or daughter, this is, apologies, this is 19th century class-based assumption that we pour, of course. But what is he saying? He's saying there's just a bunch of ordinary, in fact, fairly garish people, overfed, overcarbed, and they're not special, they're not regal, they're not born into this divinity. They've won the sort of lottery of life. And also, the more you look at this painting, all those kind of surprised eyes, you know, like they've sort of suddenly had this windfall, and everything's shiny, like they just bought all that stuff on the king's chest the day before, and he's got these sort of kind of doughy cheeks, and her arm looks a bit like a baguette, I think. There's a lot of things that are great about this, and a lot you can learn from this particular piece of writing. One is, you could only put it underneath this painting, all right? Most artist statements, and I will show you, you could put next to just about any painting, or photograph or installation or whatever it is. And I think a great way to test your writing, if you are writing an artist statement, is to look at it next to your work, and then put anything next to it. And does it still stand up? And if it does, be worried. Okay, I think good art writing is specific. All right, it shows attention to the one thing that you're looking at artworks one by one by one. It is always easier for that reason to write about one work than a whole practice. That's a test which works, and it can be quite devastating when you see that this thing about you, what you do, is actually generic. It also uses it's to the point. It uses solid visual nouns like baker and lottery and prize and family. It does not say all of this rubbish. Okay, this is basically the same concept across many, many, many words. Now, I'm not just putting that there to make fun of art speak. If you are writing about art or architecture design, count how many abstract nouns you have. Class, profession, pedestrian, trade, vending, luxury, splendor. It's one abstract idea, so non-visual, not something you can picture after the other. Okay? Know that it is very difficult to read texts that are one abstract concept after the other. All right? It just is. And if you can, my artists, when they write, I tell them I will read 3. When I get to 3, I stop reading. Usually I'm halfway through the first sentence. We all need these abstract concepts to think about, but be selective. Your art, or what you're writing about, can't be about every possible. It can't be about life and art and thinking and the digital age and capitalism and commodification. It cannot be basically a stacking up of these kinds of ideas. Be selective. And usually what someone is reading it wants to know is, how did you move from that abstract idea to a specific decision? That passage is usually what is missing. This is a work by Franz West. in which he writes what you are meant to do with the chair. You're supposed to pick it up. You can pick it up like a vase and wear it, and it's a kind of psychological, psychoanalytical encounter. And as you can see, it's self-contradicting museum needle for reasons of contradiction, for conservation, and contrary to the instructions provided by Francois. This work mustn't be used or touched. So although we do ask artists to write about their work, to think about, to verbalize the way it should be used and understood, we don't necessarily trust them, and we are willing to deny them. Having said that, I think that artists, my experience is that artists still really want texts about their work. Artists are keen for critics and others to write about it, to offer ideas that are not the ones they were necessarily thinking about. They're not always that interested in being the spokespeople for their own art making. They're not always the best at doing it. Even ones who can write are not always definitely they certainly don't have the last word. Artists certainly don't have the last word on their works. This is a piece that was at Document 13, in which Laurie Waxman, who's a critic, she gives artists 20-minute slots, and she does on-the-spot texts, one after the other. All right? And there were queues of people who were keen for her to kind of verbalize what their art means. So I might add, I think that although there's a huge plethora of art writing, I think there's a lot of ignored artists out there as well. And I had one artist who said to me in relation to good writing, bad writing, I don't care what they write, as long as they write something, as long as there's some sort of recognition and acknowledgement of what I did in words. So I don't think the desire on the part of artists to have their art thought about in text has gone down. Okay, now a little bit, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what I think are poor art writing and why, and a sort of straightforward good example. This is a, so I went to see this exhibition in London about, it was Middle Eastern art. I knew nothing about the artists on view. I really liked the show. I wanted to understand more. So I did what we all do, which is buy the catalog, and was confronted with a text like this. In brief, our exhibition is a response to an exigent disparity in critical discourse evident in the putative designation of form as subaltern to content and the posturing of referent and iconological as the cardinal gate and rule for all understanding when it comes to contemporary art in the Middle East. This, by the way, was the summary, okay? I promise you I did not dig out the worst statement. This is where they kind of summarize the even worse kind of writing. And I might add, I've read this 100 times. It makes no sense. It goes back and forth on itself so many times. I've since had a curator of this same part of the world explain this to me. It has something to do with the assumption of Middle Eastern art having always to do with language and sign rather than figuration. But where that is in there, I can't find it. Now, it's not just that there's a lot of big words, which is sort of a cheap shot. It's about 48 words, and there's 12 abstract ideas in there. So every 4 words or so, we are confronted with another abstract term, which is not explained, which is not, I have no idea where I see this in the work. I would really, if you are wondering what is, might not be communicative in your writing, write one like that if you write sort of like this, and write another one. I always tell artists, write 2 statements. Write 2. One in which you're kind of very self-conscious, and then another one, which is just you talking. You can, use a tape recorder, use whatever you want, use a friend, do a relaxed one. Texts become so solidified around certain practices that they stop serving any purpose. I would always encourage you to, have more than one, because as soon as you have more than one text about something, I do the same thing with critics. I write 2 reviews for the same show, because once you write 2, suddenly they're just words. They're just words. You can throw them up in the air, and they're not going to break. They're not going to get their feelings hurt. You can use them another time. The more relaxed you are, I think, with language, the better. But certainly, usually, students whose writing is very difficult to understand are stacking up abstract ideas one on top of the other, and usually, those of us who end up reading these statements, actually what we want to know is, how did you move from this abstract idea, okay, the politics of commodification in the digital age, to some decision making? That passage is what we're actually usually really, not the topic, but then how you moved from a general area of interest to making some decisions, whether it's materials or forms or whatever it is you did. To just leave it as a set of abstract topics, I find always quite frustrating. So I'll give you an example, an old-fashioned kind of art critic writing about ready-mades, and I use ready-mades deliberately because it's not the art, you know. I'm not making fun of the art themselves. Good art and bad art can be written about better and worse, although I'd always, usually good art generates better text, but not necessarily. But these are difficult works to write about, okay, at the time. This is about 100-year-old two artists who I'm sure you know. And this is David Sylvester writing about them, you know, 70 years later or whatever. The time when Picasso was making his first junk sculpture was also the time when Duchamp was making his first sculpture from ready-made materials. It was a bicycle wheel placed upside down on a stool. Now, the two objects assembled here are the most basic objects in man's winning dominion over the earth, and in distinguishing himself from the beasts of the field. The stool, which enables him to sit down off the ground at a height and location of his choice, and the wheel, which enables him to move himself and his objects around. The stool and the wheel are the origins of civilization, and Duchamp rendered them both useless. Picasso took junk and turned it into useful objects such as musical instruments, and Duchamp took a useful stool and a useful wheel and made them useless. Okay? I think that's good. Okay, I think that it's a completely original idea of his own. He doesn't rehash what we know about ready-mades, what we know about these artists. And what he does, and I think this is the most sort of sensible way for someone who's learning how to write about art. Okay, there's no rules, but this is a kind of way in. What is this thing? Okay, what are we looking at? Do not be afraid to explain the work. And it's not just about describing. Good description isn't just giving an inventory of what you're looking at. A good description points your direction to the side of this artwork that you're going to talk about, that you're interested in looking at. There isn't a single way to describe any artwork, and this is even more so if you're talking about, you know, time-based image or installation or a film or something that takes place over time. Your description is a selective description whereby you are bringing attention towards the sides of the artwork that you want to pay attention to. Now, the line between that and cherry picking from the artwork and making it say what you want is a dangerous one. All right? The assumption is that you are drawing our attention to something without distorting its true nature. But this is what you're doing when you're describing. I think describing, the art of description is a real one. And you're thinking about what comes next, which is so what does it mean? Okay, so what are the meanings that circulate around that those particular forms or those particular materials and images? And then the last bit, which is so what? How does it connect to the world? I mean, there's two things about this last bit. One is there's an onus, I think, on the critic to add, what is your contribution to this? Why look at this? What are you adding to the discussion, to the meaning and nature of this work? What are you contributing to culture, if we will? And also, how does it connect to the world at large? There are a million ways to do this, by the way. This is one couple of paragraphs. Some people do it over the arc of an entire book. Sometimes a book is, you know, 2 lines that do the first jobs and the last one does the third, or any combination therein. Okay, this is a nice succinct example of that. Not always is it that way, all right, the way these moments are distributed. But basically, I think you take something away. I also think all good writing tells you something you didn't already know. Okay, a lot of artist statements, they're not terrible, or I say artist statements, a lot of texts on art, but they don't tell me anything I didn't already know or could already see. You do, I think all good texts really do tell you. You come away with something you didn't know before you started. I also think there's one idea here that he sees through. Okay, you don't get to the end about this business about usefulness and uselessness and say, where did this come from, David? He's taken you there, right? He shows you what he's looking at in the work, what it might mean, and where this idea comes from. Very, very succinctly, very, very clearly, simple language. That's a skill that I think for any writer is really worth trying to learn. Okay, most sort of reviews by very, very kind of amateurish writers, every paragraph, sometimes every line, is about a different thing. My work's about the history of photography. No, it's not. It's about gender. The next thing you know, it's about some other idea. And every line is a different idea. It's very hard to kind of read that kind of scattergun writing. And it's the discipline of taking one idea through is I think worth learning, and not that easy. Okay. Sometimes students think that just having one idea isn't enough. Well, actually, if it's developed and I can see where it's from, I'm much more interested than a million sort of batting around possibilities in a piece of finished writing. Okay, this is not diary writing. This is published writing. Just to say another text on a ready-made that I would put as a poor example would be this one. This was on a museum website about Haig Yang's gymnastics with the foldables. You can read it for yourself. I mean, how does this folded, clothes dryer trespass on, patriarchal society and human conditions and abstraction affect? By the way, this was the whole text. Okay, it's not like, again, I took out the worst bit. So I believe it might do that, but all of the joining up between what I'm looking at and the thing and the discussion of it, I'm missing all the in-between pieces. All right, and making that passage, I think, is what the writer's job is, and making it interesting and kind of worth following. You could not, this work you could put under almost any artwork. You could only put that text under that work, okay? Test your texts like that, test them. Could you put this text about this work of design or this painting under anything? And if you can, be worried. Okay, I'm going to leave this example, if you don't mind. This is from a press release. Cockburn is interested in the sense of connection invoked by awkward shared space and experience. She explores the impulsive judgments we make about one another, fantastical histories, biographies, and characters projected onto unknown faces, or imaginative attempts to understand those around us. This text will work next to just about any figurative piece that you put next to it. It'll just work. What work in which you have two people, at least, or even one figure, it so works for this painting, okay? Because it would work for anything, all right? And it is one way to test, and it's a devastating way to test. It really will make you, kind of force you to make some decisions about, okay, so how are these judgments made? How are these histories being told? What I know is that even having taught students this a lot, it's difficult, all right? Even though they get it, actually to be able to be specific about what they do is in writing it's tough. It's not easy, okay? And I think that's why there's so much poor writing in the art world, because it's easy to write badly about art. It's not as easy to write in a really kind of devastatingly concise, straight to the point, really observant, really imaginative, linguistically rich way. Okay, so I'm going to move from that. I'm just going to look a little bit at some artists' responses to writing. So, having tired, of course, of the kind of model, the Jackson Pollock, Greenbergian, let somebody else do the talking for me, I'm too busy sort of listening to jazz, and my whole consciousness is beyond language. I might add, if you ever heard Pollock talk about art, you probably, I feel he was lucky he had Greenberg, actually. But anyway, at some point the art begins to talk back, okay? All right? And it's not that the one-way relationship, okay, where the Greenberg or a critic is putting language onto the work, but the other way around. Another thing to really bear in mind is the whole idea about de-skilling, which was, of course, hugely important in the conceptual art practice and is a wonderful kind of, and I think still valid idea worth pursuing about making art, all right? That you are not being prized for a particular skill. And the de-skilling of writing itself was taking place alongside that. There were other means with which to produce text. And we're going to look a minute at Warhol, because I think he was really, usually we think of the great writer of the period as Smithson, all right, the one most innovating about language. And like everyone, I love Smithson. To me, he's like Blake, right? His text and image are completely combined. You couldn't possibly take them apart or prioritize any of them. But Warhol is usually considered just an image maker. I think the way he generated text alongside a million other revolutions that he did. He invented, of course, the selfie. He invented reality TV. He invented the rock show light gig. When you look, he reinvented the celebrity magazine, and I think innovated about language. So whilst, of course, Smithson is the hero of this particular period, all right, because he had this fantastic talent across image and language. He's a very frustrating writer. It's very difficult to learn from Smithson, I find, because it's just so, it's such a particular poetry that if you try to imitate it, it's very, very, he's a very difficult writer, I think, to learn from, because it's so his own. That's, you can dispute that, of course. And he puts together his relationship to the places he sees. I'm sure you know this. I will remind you. Smithson takes a bus one morning out to his hometown, actually, of Passaic, on the other side of the Hudson, and walks around this wasteland of sort of industrial ruin and rethinks what the ruin can be, and comes up with the idea about ruins in reverse, ruins that enter into ruin from the moment they are first conceived. And he presents these works like temples, like great works of architecture. He's a great storyteller. Storytelling is a great way to get information across. And they're completely embedded, okay? The art and the image. The text does not stand alongside the art. And I think this is more and more the way artists are thinking about in recent years. The text that stands outside of the image as a kind of awful, self-serving caption is increasingly resisted against. Okay, so these are a few examples that you might know. And artists very quickly became aware of the possibility of shortcuts and cheating and the silliness that could very quickly arise from these from art writing, and that it could become formulaic and was not always quite the kind of wonderful outlet. And in fact, you may know there's now a website which will generate an artist statement for you. There's a few key words that will get plugged in on your behalf. They're all exactly the same, and it talks about my relationship between and your influences, and as a child, I did this. It's exactly the same text, and they'll plug in different key terms. I think this is a brilliant project, because it actually, you know what? You might as well. You might as well, rather than, and then get one of these out of the way, these awful things, and then write something real. All right, do your second text. The thing about artist statements is that basically all the freedom that you have in your studio as artists, using machines and collaborators and ready-mades and all of those things that we've had for 100 years, are not allowed in the artist statement. Right? There's a certain format. There's a certain technique, there's certain materials. You have to use the English language, by and large, for most applications and things. So all of the freedom and the international, the breaking down of boundaries, and in the artist language, artist statement returns, all of those freedoms that we have. You could write this with a quill and ink, right? Just as well as you could write this on the screen. It's as if history has never happened, right? It's just to accelerate the understanding of art in a very, very, I think, formulaic way. And I would advise against it. There's other sort of jokes that you can find online if Leonardo had to write his artist statement and whatever. But I think that the technology, this is a picture of Rosalind Krauss, a painting, this is a very famous photograph of the critic Rosalind Krauss. The impact of technology on our relationship between the image and text should be looked at. By the way, it's always a question of making your relationship to the text strange if you're struggling with language. I was just talking with Simon, there's this famous story of Hunter S. Thompson typing over The Great Gatsby. Do you know the story? He typed over The Great Gatsby. And I said, why? Why would you do that? And he said, I just want to know how it feels to write like that. I just want to know how it feels. And Benjamin was very fetishistic about his pens and stuff. I think all those like little tricks and schemes to get you writing, pretend you're writing to someone you love, pretend you're writing to someone you know well, put pictures of people who you speak to easily to help your words. I think all those tricks are absolutely valid. Okay, usually poor writing is where your relationship to the technology itself can be renewed. You can look at ways of making monochromes through language. I stole this from Ryan Gander. He makes monochromes like that. So you Google in green and hit images, or black, or red, or blue, yellow. It doesn't work for pink, as I discovered. And also then I thought, oh gosh, could you really go crazy with this? What does sheer joy look like? What does total fulfillment look like? This isn't how I imagined it, but apparently that's what total fulfillment looks like. Okay, so the very last section that I'm just going to go through is in artists who embed text within their practice, okay, within their art making. And I do think a great example is Warhol, mostly because he didn't write and he didn't read. Okay, if he had a particular, if he was Smithson, it's not that, I mean, Smithson's wonderful, but he was a born writer, you know what I mean? And Warhol was anything but a born writer by his own admission. English was probably his second language, and he was very good at surrounding himself, finding ways in which to produce text. Believe it or not, over the course of his lifetime, he produced over 100 books. Over 100 books. Here's someone who can't write and produced over 100 books. Some of them are exclusively illustration, of course, and not all of them have text. He ran his own publishing house. And this, you know, we don't even think of Warhol as if Warhol had just done text, honestly, he'd be a really interesting artist. You could get rid of the Campbell soup cans and all of it. His relationship to writing and art writing is wonderful. In 1966, there was an interview with Gretchen Berg, who invents a way of generating text. He tried a lot of different ways to write about his work. He had his mother, of course, ventriloquized for him. That's his mother's handwriting, okay? He always had other people doing the talking. At some point, he asked Gerard Malanga to do an interview with him about Empire, and they just lifted text right out of the Empire State Building publicity brochure, you know, just ready-made text. It's ridiculous. It sounds nothing like Warhol. Sometimes the texts, of course, were like every Warhol loved to be explained and given instructions from which to work. He created artists' books which had more or less elements of language alongside text. But in 1966, a woman named Gretchen Berg interviews him, and she spent days with him. Okay, she really found great ways to they had a great connection. And she tapes it and turns it into a single monologue. In other words, she sort of self-effacing 23-year-old woman takes herself out of the tape. It's as if it's all one big monologue from Warhol, okay? And so a lot of the lines that you know, like "I want to be a machine," or the most important, most famous one, which is, if you want to understand Warhol, just look at the surface of my art and my movies and me, and there's nothing behind them. She actually said those things, okay? She actually, since we've gone back and listened to the tapes, she says, so it's just surface. And he says, yeah, of your movies and your films and things. Yeah. So there's nothing else to understand? No. All right. And she redacts this into this single concept, which are then, they put the words in his mouth. It's just like the ventriloquizing he did. He gets somebody else to do the talking. Now, everyone I've spoken to who was involved in this process with Warhol says, yeah, but the ideas were always his. And most of the people, in fact, all the people who worked this way with him, went on to do kind of nothing, okay? I think it's important to know they are still Warhol's words. They are still his texts. But he found a way to use machines, the tape recorder. Warhol was one of the first private citizens in the world to have a tape recorder. I don't mean one of the first artists to work with tape recorders, one of the first people to own one, because he got Norelco company to give him one. And he got other people to do the talking and to do the transcribing and to turn it into text. All right, he was brilliant at making this happen. And I've spoken to Pat Hackett and the people who did this, and so he read everything, and he gave great instructions, but he really had other people, like for the other ways in which you work, to produce text. And thus, there he went, writing books, writing magazines. The first chapter of The Philosophy of Andy Warhol was actually written, Bob Colacello, who was he was like this wordsmith in the group, they were pitched to write his philosophy. He said, yeah, that's a great idea. And so got working on it the next day. Warhol didn't believe in schedules and planning. He just, great idea, let's start right this minute, and he would. So Bob Colacello writes the first chapter. Warhol reads it and says it's too short. So he reads it over the phone to Bridget Berlin, who is his superstar turned receptionist at the factory. And she's very clever. She's also an artist, a very good friend of Warhol's. She adds a lot of sharp comments and her own kind of input. And this tape, right, Colacello's words, Bridget Berlin's comments, is given to Pat Hackett, person number 3, to turn into text. And that's the first chapter is produced like that. Okay, so it's incredible, insane sort of collaboration and voices to produce the philosophy of Andy Warhol. He was very, very reticent to give up credit on his own work. Subsequent works, though, written texts, he gave credit. So this is him on the phone. He taped Bridget Berlin. He got her input. And of course, the diaries themselves are written over the phone. And they're a fantastic sort of monument to how he worked and how he thought. One way, for example, to think about how embedded text and image was, he very rarely talked about making art itself. Okay, very rarely talked about that. If you think about the Coca-Cola quote, do you know the Coca-Cola quote? Famous Coca-Cola quote. If you don't, you're very lucky to be here today because it's fantastic. What's great about this country, said Warhol, is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You could be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you can know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. All the Cokes are the same, and all the Cokes are good. Liz Taylor knows it, the president knows it, the bum knows it, and you know it. Okay, so it's a democratization through consumption. All right, everyone gets the same thing. And if you think about it, these are the exact same topics of the Death and Disaster series that he was working on around this same time, okay? So just like Coke is the same for everybody, so is death, right? So death is, Liz Taylor almost died, the president died, and, just think, you can die too, all right? So he has this kind of the overlaps between his texts, his art making, what he was thinking, and how he worked I think, as Kenneth Goldsmith wrote, who's the person we're going to look at next, is a single seamless weft and warp. Okay. Some quick examples of people who are innovating with language and image. Now, this is Kenneth Goldsmith's Ubu Web, which is 20 years old today, this year, I should say. And it is, of course, an archive. He understands immediately, before anybody else does, the advantages of the web over books is, one, it's infinitely expandable, and two, it can host moving image, right? Two things that books cannot do. And he immediately gets to work just gathering and compiling and putting these things together. And he is, of course, a master of ready-made text, but also, he's also a great writer, make no mistake. And this is his book, Capital, in which he returns to Benjamin's unfinished Arcades project, gathering texts about Paris from different sources, and he revisits that in New York and creates this sort of giant brick, appropriately enough for the city, of ready-made text. And he's constantly sort of mining these early examples, as he puts it, with the internet, just as painting found photography, all right, language has found its photography. The internet is a generator of text, a generator of automated text, and it is no longer this kind of willful, sort of literal transposition between sort of language. This is an early sort of pre-Fluxus work, and a transposition, a relationship to history that is borrowing from it. Language, in fact, works in its own way. An artist like Frances Stark, my best thing, she takes a chat room language and turns this into the basis of a video piece, and then eventually of a book as well. And so she's sort of mining used language, mining the way dialogues are somehow somewhere between the written word, right, because they're typed, and sort of a casual conversation. An artist like Hito Sterl, who I'm sure you all know, she goes and uses, I think her real format, I think, is the lecture, okay, where it's, she takes as a given that language has, art has this didactic purpose, all right, that we expect to learn, we expect to extract language of meaning from images, and she talks you through it and performs them beautifully alongside, of course, a video practice and other kinds of art making. An artist like John Kelsey, this is a painting by Albert Oehlen, uses language and diagramming to think through how art is working. I think if you are good with drawing and patterning, I think this is absolutely very, very helpful in thinking through work. John Kelsey is an artist, he's a critic, he's a gallerist. He's been in Frieze magazine as a writer, he's been reviewed, and his gallery reviewed. So he's an advertiser, reviewer, and a writer in the same issue. Okay, so he crosses, not least using language, across these different roles. Some of you may have seen Remainder, Tom McCarthy's book. If you know the book itself, does people know Tom McCarthy's novel? You gotta read these books, they're so good. So a guy's walking down the street and a big piece of cement lands on his head. The consequences are two. One is we don't know how crazy he is. Two is he wins millions of dollars. He never has to worry about money again. And he becomes obsessed with recreating this one tiny memory from his past. And he has endless crews, endless people to recreate this one moment of his life. Every character, every sound, every detail. The cat's got to be walking across the roof in exactly that way. The motorcycle has to be revving in the courtyard. And he goes through, and his recreation of this exact moment becomes his obsession. So in retelling the story over and over and over to the crew, but we're reading it in words, right? So the transposition between memory and language and instruction and reality is constantly overlapping. Okay, I think, don't know if we have time for many more examples. Are people getting tired? Okay, I'll give you a couple more. Katrina Palmer's work, she actually just recently, of course, had a show here at the Henry Moore Institute. One of my favorite artists. She was a novelist, she's a writer, she worked in publishing for a long time, and then went to Central St. Martin's. This is a recent project from last year called The Loss Adjusters on Portland Island, which is an island, as I'm sure you all know, it's an island just off the south coast of Britain, and it's Portland stone. All the British Museum and all of those big white buildings in London and elsewhere are built from the stone, the marble-like stone that was compacted over a few millennia and produced this very, very, very curious landscape, which has basically been quarried for years and years, for centuries. And so it's sort of pockmarked with all of these holes and histories that are very, very visible in the landscape itself. So it begins in this very kind of desolate office where you are handed a map and headphones, and you walk through the city, the island itself, and the story unfolds. And there's lots of wonderful sort of equations between weights that are, every time you take something out of the earth, of course, you create an equal weight outside of the earth, and comparisons with these all of the little holes of the graves and the much bigger holes of the quarries and other moments throughout the landscape. And she creates, she does not waste this opportunity. It's a sculpture waiting to happen, basically, Portland Island, and she takes full advantage of it. There's very little really happening on the island. There's a youth offenders, like a juvenile prison, I suppose. It's been there for a long time. It has layers of its own history that are kind of mined, if you will, as you walk through it. Simon Welsh is a poet and artist. He creates these portrait poems. This was at the ICA this year, in which you book a session with him, not unlike Laurie Waxman, where you'd get a quick piece of criticism about your work, and he will write a poem about and for you. And really, his ethos is really not so much about language or art, but really about connections across people, creating ways in which to create ways overcoming barriers between strangers, using obviously poetry and the museum setting in this case. Anna Barnum works with translation, in which there's a text which gets read and reread and translated through numbers, through different participants. It's basically a very, very long and elaborate but rather wonderful game of Chinese whispers, which are then fed electronically to produce, at the beginning and the end, different different artworks, different products from this 2-week transposition. And finally, Bruce McLean, speaking of using machines and to generate text, he had a wonderful performance in which he interviews himself. He takes off his glasses, he talks to himself seriously, then he sort of mimics the language of the interviewer, the critic, and the artist overlapping in a single figure. And finally, another example you might want to know is Deborah Coughlin and Gaggle, in which she finds old speeches from the past and replays them and reperforms them, sometimes with professionals, sometimes with non-professional performers. Sort of another way of telling history and thinking about history, and this is interspersed with this particular sort of choral band, which have their own kind of musical, a bit of like a Greek chorus in between the sort of more heavier content of the speeches themselves. So the questions that when writing about art, I think to ask does meaning adhere to art? Is it in the art, and the writer extracts it and buries it and brings it to the surface, or is it actually produced by the words? Okay, is it like a spell? You know, that you if you make special words around a work of art, like an incantation, art is somehow produced, and without it, it doesn't. It's hard to make art that's never talked about. Okay, it's hard to have work that is never talked about or written about take sort of gain traction in the art system. Are the works being talked into existence, or is art writing a parasite? Right? What is that relationship? Is it cleave itself to works that would be better off without them, or vice versa? Without it's a helpful tool. It's something that is clearing the way, helping you have a kind of clear experience of the art. And a big question is also, who is it for? I definitely write for artists. That's really, I'm only interested in their opinion of my writing, if I'm writing about their work. But I don't think all critics or all people, you know, who are you writing for? Who is your main constituency? Who's your readership? One of the nice things about the fact that we don't get paid very much, which is okay, is you could really, it gives you a lot of freedom. I think critics and writers in the art world have a lot of freedom. It's why Kenneth Goldman says he loves poetry, because no one's fighting over their space. You can do whatever you want. So there's a certain freedom in that lack of sort of financial return. Okay, so the very, very, very last thing I'm going to do is my own sort of experiment in changing the relationship between text and image. We always take objects and produce text from them. So I thought, what if we do the other way around? What if we take a text and produce an object from it? And the text I took was the opening page of Madame Bovary. Charles Bovary walks into a classroom. He's a child. And he's holding this cap. Okay, it's very famous. Nabokov wrote about this particular moment in literature. And the cap is a very strange composite, the way it's described. And like Charles, of course, it is a symbol for this character that we are going to meet. He's trying to be all things to all people and fails on every count. So this is the text. The new fellow was still holding his cap on his knees, even after prayers were over. It was one of those headgears of composite order in which we can find traces of the bearskin, the shako, the billycock hat, sealskin cap, and cotton nightcap. One of those poor things, in fine, whose dumb ugliness has depths of expression like an imbecile's face. Oval, stiffened with whalebone, it began with 3 round knobs that came in succession lozenges of velvet and rabbit skin separated by a red band. After that, a sort of bag that ended in a cardboard polygon covered with complicated braiding, from which hung at the end of a long thin cord, small twisted gold threads in the manner of a tassel. The cap was new, its peak shone. Okay, you can picture that perfectly, I'm sure. This is part of the exercise here, is be careful when you're describing. You want to be selective. If you inventory everything, it might be very difficult to follow. But I did ask myself, like, what's a shako? What's a billycock, you know? So using Google Images, you can do anything with Google Images. I found all those things. All right, so would you like to see what this cap looks like? All right. So the new fellow was still holding in his cap on his knees even after prayers were over. It was one of those headgears of composite order in which we can find traces of the bearskin, the shako, billycock hat, the sealskin cap, and cotton nightcap. One of those poor things, in fine, whose dumb ugliness has depths of expression like an imbecile's face. Oval, stiffened with whalebone, it began with 3 round knobs, then came in succession a lozenges of velvet and rabbit skin separated by a red band. After that, a sort of bag that ended in a cardboard polygon covered with complicated braiding, from which hung at the end of a long thin cord small twisted gold threads in the manner of a tassel. The cap was new, its peak shone. And then, Googling, I discovered that someone actually tried to concoct this. I tried to build this thing. What would this thing look like? And apparently, that is the answer. And I was looking at this, and I thought, I've seen that. And I thought, oh, it's a Gary Webb. No, it's not. And it's a Rachel Harrison, I think, perhaps. Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments? I know.
I'd like to ask, what about more implicit forms of writing within contemporary art, like the fact that there's a turn towards kind of filmmaking and narrative within kind of a lot of kind of artist films and things which have a lot of writing involved in terms of script writing, which doesn't come out as kind of script token, but actually as kind of a form of writing. If you think about the amount of film essays as well, which are heavily narrated as kind of theoretical, often quite complex texts over kind of imagery. I wonder what you think about those kind of things that happen.
That's a good question, and probably I avoid it because I know very little about script writing. And one thing I would want to, I think it's important to bear in mind differences between performed speech and written speech and read speech, and they're really different, you know. And so I think script writing is a very different, you know, hugely valuable part of. And you're absolutely right. But I think it's.
But often kind of feature films are posited as a literary medium that are turned into visuals as opposed to a kind of. So they're seen as a kind of written medium in the first place because the script is so important, as opposed to. And a lot of the kind of film essays I'm talking about are often explanations about the images that we're looking at in that kind of art historical kind of way. So it seems like, you know, the word is being used within artworks as kind of criticism, not just as a stand-up, as a kind of counterpart.
I think you're right. I mean, it's very difficult teaching that alongside this. So when I was teaching artists about writing, teaching script writing and teaching any other kind of prose writing, much less academic writing, it's a very different thing, because I think usually the image does come first, not just in a sort of hierarchical way, but in terms of your perception and your sort of accessing the work. So I think it's something, having tried script writing and failed, I think it's a very different, it's such a different way of thinking through the text. The best explanation I ever got about good script writing is write the script the way you hear it, and then take out anything that explains what's on the images, and whatever's left is probably pretty good. Even if it's just like, that's probably a pretty good script. But it's not the way. It's a very different kind of skill.
So let's ask a question about writing in a fine art course.
Yeah.
What your thoughts about how that might be approached or assessed, or I know it's a bit of a technical question, but...
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a difficult one, because the reality, for example, teaching curators is that they are asked to write, you know, educational material, and so the space practically for a lot of creative thought is very restricted. So I think that it's a difficult thing to kind of put together. I usually have sessions where I just talk about academic writing, which I love academic writing. Okay, I think the discipline of academic writing is really worth learning, but that's hard enough without trying to make it some other kind of creative operation, which I usually keep separately. I think it's absolutely valid to teach someone what is academic writing, why is it different. Okay, it's building on the ideas of others to produce research-based knowledge. That's what it is. Okay, not all writing has to do that, and there's a discipline to it, and there's ways to facilitate someone achieving that. And so in that sense, I'm quite old-fashioned. I do show this is how you do that. These are good. This is how it's done. I have a lot of thoughts about that, because I think that kind of writing in which you're explaining where all your ideas come from there's a politics to it. You know, where do you get these ideas? Should we believe you? Is this trustworthy, sound, ethical information? And that's what academic writing does. It explains where the ideas come from. In most writing, you don't have to do that, but there's a beauty in that I actually do support and try to teach. I think that answered your question. Ish. I mean, when I teach writers to write, I have them write what I call the monkey text, which is the really boring artist statement. we get that out of the way, and then we talk about other options. Okay, but I try to also, they walk away with something they can use in a lot of contexts. Okay.
I was so interested in talking about Hans Ulrich Obrist not doing his own writing. I had a friend who spent a day with him, and they went around the galleries together. And my friend was explaining to me how he doesn't do his own reading either.
Oh, really?
Because he had 7 assistants, and 2 of them got into this chauffeur car that went all around the galleries in London. Because at the time, my friend was kind of, we're never going to make it around all these galleries on the tube. He was trying to work out how he could go to all these things. But then this kind of limo pulled up. They got into the limo. They took 2 of the assistants with them. And then the assistants pulled out all these magazines, and they'd highlighted the bits of the reviews that they needed to read before they got to the galleries. So the reading had been done in preparation for them as well, which is quite amazing.
Yeah. He does do interviews.
Yes, the interviews are fantastic.
Yeah, he does. And all artists, the artists of a certain generation I was doing, they all wanted him, I have to say. They really did all want him. So,
But just to say, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
That's helpful.
Thank you very much, Gilda Williams. Thank you. That's brilliant. Yeah, I want to get one of the hats now.
Yeah.